Mr. John Fowler is a public historian. He's also a park ranger and a volunteer coordinator at the Mary McLeod Bethune Council House. And he will be discussing Mary McLeod Bethune today, as well as the home that is under the auspices of the National Park Service. Now, there are roughly 413 national park units within the national park system, and about 20 to 30 directly relate to facilities, memorials that are associated with African Americans. And he's going to be discussing today as I said, the Mary McLeod Bethune House, which is actually in Northwest Washington. Just as one quick anecdote, I used to live in that neighborhood. It's in Logan Circle area. And I do know that right in that same block, their neighbor happens to be one of the local headquarters of the Daughters of the United Confederacy. So I just find that often, I used to be somehow an historical dissonance to see that they were neighbors, but hey, that's the way it is. Let me just give you a quick overview of Mr. Fowler. So he currently is a National Park Service Ranger, and as I indicated before, a volunteer coordinator at the Mary McLeod Bethune Council House and the Carter G. Woodson National Historic Site, which he will be discussing next week. He received his master's degree in history from Howard University, and he holds a BA degree in history from the University of the District of Columbia. He's a 2012 graduate. We were joking about it because I happen to be a 1972 graduate, so he's 40 years ahead of me when it comes to the University of the District of Columbia. So he's doing research on Andrew Fowler, who happens to be his grandfather. So he is also a published author, and he also does public speaking when it comes to historical issues associated with the National Park Service. So without further ado, I'd like to give a warm round of applause to Mr. Fowler and our guest speaker. And also I'd like to thank everyone for coming. We were hoping for a bigger turnout, but we are where we are, so we'll just have to live with it. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. You all can hear me all right? Let me take this opportunity again to thank Mr. Mitchell and his staff for reaching out to me and inviting me to represent the Park Service. I don't know if you're aware, but the Park Service celebrating its centennial. Just not last week, but the week before last, we celebrated August 25th, the 100th anniversary of the Park Service. And so one of the missions of the Park Service during our centennial is to get people who normally don't come to these parks to get them to come out and visit these other National Historic Sites, as well as the monuments and the other much larger parks. I know in my case, most people when you think of the Park Service, you may think of Yosemite, the Grand Canyon, places like that, but to know that there are places that tell the stories of regular people, everyday people, that's pretty amazing. And I just so happen to work for the Park Service, where we interpret the lives of two very important people, Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune and Dr. Carter G. Woodson. As Mr. Mitchell mentioned, I'll talk about Dr. Woodson next week, but today we're going to talk about Mary McLeod Bethune. For the last 6 years, I've been stationed at the Mary McLeod Bethune Council House, National Historic Site, one of the 413 units of the National Park System. The house was purchased in 1943 for $15,500 to serve as the first national headquarters of the National Council of Negro Women. The National Council of Negro Women is an organization that was established in 1935 by Mary McLeod Bethune to serve as the authoritative voice of African American women living in the United States. So it's a pretty remarkable story. Mrs. Bethune was a remarkable woman. And before we talk a little bit about the house, the history of the house, I do want to talk about Mary McLeod Bethune and who she was and all that she accomplished. Mary McLeod Bethune, again, one of the most important figures in all of American history. Born July 10th, 1875 in Maysville, South Carolina. She's the 15th of 17 children. The first to be born free and the first to receive an education. You see here a picture of her parents, Samuel and Patsy McLeod. After emancipation, her family, they became sharecroppers, and her father and 4 of her older brothers built this cabin there at the bottom picture in which she was born. Mrs. Bethune had the unusual opportunity to attend school and to receive an education. Again, in Maysville, South Carolina, this was the first time that they had decided to open a school in that community. The Presbyterian Church sent missionaries down to Maysville and opened this school, and Mrs. Bethune was allowed to go. She was different from the rest of her siblings. There was just something different about her. She loved learning. She lived to read, to learn. And her parents, realizing that, allowed her to go to this school. So this slide is just talking more about Mrs. Bethune's education, the impact of the 13th Amendment. The name of the school she attended was the Trinity Presbyterian Mission School, located 5 miles from her home. During this time period, most schools, they were called normal schools. They learned the basics, reading, writing, and arithmetic. Just more information on Mrs. Bethune's education. She finished this mission school, she graduated. She received a scholarship to attend the Scotia Seminary in Concord, North Carolina. And from there, she graduated with the intention to be a missionary. And she wanted to go to Africa to do missionary work. But at that time, there were no openings. So she then received another scholarship, this time to the Moody Bible Institute. Again, learning all aspects of missionary work. She graduates from Moody. She writes to the Presbyterian Church again and says, I still want to go to Africa to be a missionary. Well, this time the Presbyterian Church actually wrote back and said that they were not sending African Americans to Africa to be missionaries at this time. Mrs. Bethune was very upset about that, but she decided that if she could not be a missionary in Africa, she could stay here in America and see if she could, make a difference somehow. And she realized that education was the way to make a difference. So she begins teaching in various places throughout the South Carolina. She returned home to South Carolina to teach. She taught at the Haynes Institute in Augusta, Georgia. And then she later got married to another school teacher named Albertus Bethune. So that's where Bethune comes from. They get married in 1898. She has their only child, Albert, a year later. And she continues teaching. It's during these years that Mrs. Bethune realized that she wanted to start her own school. She wanted to start her own institution. So she sets out to Daytona Beach, Florida, to build this school. She gets a tip from someone saying that they are constructing the Florida East Coast Railway system. And Negroes in America at that time, as they were called, they're flocking from all over the South to Daytona to get these jobs that are going to be, coming about with the construction of this railway system. So Ms. Bethune decides to go to Daytona Beach. And there, on October 4th, 1904, she opens her school. The name of the school is the Daytona Normal and Industrial Institute for Negro Girls. And she starts the school with $1.50 and faith in God. That's how she always told the story. And from there, she literally built a school. She literally built an institution. So when you talk about Mary McLeod Bethune, the first and foremost thing that you must know about her is that she was an educator. While trying to raise funds for her school, she became heavily involved in the African American club women's movement of the early part of the 20th century. The idea of black women uniting and creating clubs and organizations was nothing new. It dates back to the mid to late 1800s. Mrs. Bethune happened to stumble upon a meeting of the National Association of Colored Women. These women, like Mrs. Bethune, they were also school teachers. They had started schools, orphanages, old age homes. But Mrs. Bethune realized from meeting with these women that she was able to, she made an alliance with them. She was able to meet like-minded women. So Mrs. Bethune became very active and involved in the National Association of Colored Women. However, by 1924, when she becomes the organization's 8th president, she realizes that there needed to be an organization of black women that not only dealt with social issues, but dealt with issues affecting legislation, an organization that was able to lobby Congress. Now, by this time, this is the late 1920s, Bethune herself has sort of become a relatively nationally known figure. By this time period, she's become an advisor to President Calvin Coolidge, and then President Herbert Hoover. She was called to Washington by both of those presidents to serve on their committees and commissions dealing with child welfare and education. So Mrs. Bethune was in a position to express the concerns of African Americans, in particular African American women and children. So after she ends her presidency of the National Association of Colored Women, she sets the plans in motion to start the National Council of Negro Women. So December 5th, 1935, she starts the National Council of Negro Women at the age of 60. Now, I know that's an age where, most people think about retirement, but not Mrs. Bethune. Also in 1935, actually a few months earlier, Mrs. Bethune is called back to Washington, this time to serve as an advisor to the National Youth Administration, one of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal agencies created to combat the Great Depression. A year later, in 1936, she's named the director of the Division of Negro Affairs. They create her own agency specifically, well, not her own agency, but an agency specifically for African American youth. So at this point in time, at the age of 61, Mary McLeod Bethune becomes the first African American woman to head a federal government agency. So when you talk about minorities working in the federal government, women, Mrs. Bethune was certainly a trailblazer. So it's pretty amazing. She's started her own school. She's president of this school. It eventually becomes a well-known and respected college. It becomes internationally known as Bethune-Cookman College. She starts the National Council of Negro Women. She's working with the presidents and government. So she had a lot of work cut out for her. Now, Mrs. Bethune, this picture here, they're in the parlor there at 1318 Vermont Avenue, Council House. Again, they bought this home in 1943 for $15,500. So it is while at this home, Bethune was able to still serve as president of her school, work with President Roosevelt's administration, and serve as president of the NCNW. Bethune with President Truman. She advised President Truman, served on his committee of 12 on national defense. So in total, she served 4 U.S. presidents. Something else that another piece of the history we interpret at the Council House is not only Mary McLeod Bethune's activism, but also that of the National Council of Negro Women. The National Council of Negro Women were very much involved during World War II in the war effort. Mrs. Bethune herself served as a general of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. She herself handpicked the first 40 African American women to serve in the armed forces. They served in the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. And Mrs. Bethune and the council were able to raise funds, $2 million, by selling war bonds to get a Liberty ship, the SS Harriet Tubman, to get this Liberty ship constructed and built. This was the only Liberty ship that was named for an African American woman during this time, during the war. The council worked on various initiatives during the war effort. We served America against selling the war bonds, trying to get the armed services services desegregated. Another aspect to Mrs. Bethune's life and career, and that of the NCW, was that they were some of the first chroniclers, preservationists of Black women's history. That collection, they started their own collection, their own archive, there in the boardroom at the Council House. In 1966, the council had a fire. The house fire occurred in the house, of the council had to relocate. And the house was empty for about a good decade. Then in the mid-70s, it was restored. And Dorothy Height, who was the 4th president of the council, she got the idea to, restore the home, open to the public as a museum, and to start an archive. Again, the archive, the collection had begun in the Council House. The nucleus of that collection are the records of the National Council of Negro Women. Then you have Mrs. Bethune's personal papers, other papers and photographs documenting the history of other well-known Black women and their organizations, their work in civil rights issues, things of that nature. This archive, the National Archives for Black Women's History, was officially established. The only repository in the United States that you can see how the archives looks, some of the files. In addition to NCW starting their own archive, they had several well-known periodicals. The Afro-American Women's Journal, Women's United, it was a magazine. They, they were a national organization. It was their job to, get the concerns of Black women and children out to mainstream America. So these are the types of things, are the types of documents that you can find in the archive. So it's not just papers and photographs, but they're dolls. We have a collection from Faith Ringgold, the noted artist, Lois Mailou Jones. We have some of Dorothy Height's papers and even articles of clothing. These are the types of things that even after Mrs. Bethune died, she died in 1955, the council was still able to, keep on this work, this legacy. And this is a photograph of just some of the still unprocessed collections of the National Archives for Black Women's History that are still waiting to be processed. There's still stories untold. The carriage house behind the council house, that is where the archives was located until 2014. So it's since been relocated to our Museum Resource Center in Landover, Maryland. So this is a photograph there at that center, that facility. Microfilm, of course. So in addition to managing the council house, we also manage the Capitol Hill Parks. And the Capitol Hill Parks are 4 parks located here in Washington, 4 historic parks: Lincoln Park, Stanton Park, Marion Park, and Folger Park. The most known park and the largest of these parks is Lincoln Park, located 13th and East Capitol Streets Northeast. It is in Lincoln Park where Mrs. Bethune's statue is located. The first statue, the first monument erected to honor an African American or a woman in a federal public park here in Washington, D.C. As you may not know, but Lincoln Park was considered part of Pierre L'Enfant's original plan layout for Washington, D.C. The statue that was there before Mrs. Bethune's statue was erected was called the Emancipation Group statue, and it was erected honoring President Abraham Lincoln. Close to 10 years after he was assassinated, it was paid for by that of the formerly enslaved people. And it used to face the Capitol. But when Mrs. Bethune's statue was erected, her birthday in 1974, they turned the Emancipation Group statue around to face Mrs. Bethune's statue. And these are just some images of the council house today. We're open every day. First tour at 9, last tour at 4 o'clock. We are actually very soon in the near future going to be closing temporarily to receive a fire suppression system, which is long overdue. But again, there at the council house, you get to see original artifacts, original furniture that was furnished, that was purchased by Mrs. Bethune and the National Council of Negro Women. That concludes the presentation. Are there any questions? We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Yes.
So you were talking about the facility, Offsite facility, where there are all the archival materials that it hasn't been amongst. Is there a plan in place to kind of go through those things eventually, or it's kind of untouched and you guys have to think about what to do?
So there is a plan. I was just actually notified not too long ago that we got some money to hire some staff to be out there at that facility to specifically handle our collection. Because it's a lot of work, working with, in an archive, dealing with collections. And this facility, it not only houses our archive, but it houses other collections from Park Service units from all over the country. So we've got things from the Douglas Home, from Vietnam Veterans Memorial, all kinds of things. And things that you wouldn't normally associate with being in an archive. Those things are there. But yes, there are plans to process those collections. Any other questions? Yes.
museum, has there been a stamp, a postage stamp of Mrs. Bethune?
Yes. So she was actually Mrs. Bethune was actually the second African American woman, I believe, to be featured on a postage stamp. The first was Harriet Tubman, and Mrs. Bethune's stamp, I believe, was 1985, March 85, the Black Heritage Series. During this time period in the 70s, when the house when the council house was dormant and they were trying to restore it. During this time period, the study and discipline of Black women's history as a scholarly topic, as a subject, was becoming prevalent, much more prevalent. So it was during this time period that you begin to find the mainstream having a greater appreciation for Black women's history. So I'm thinking, in light of that climate, that led to a push on trying to get people like Harriet Tubman on the stamp. Mrs. Bethune, I think after Mrs. Bethune may have been Madam C.J. Walker, things of that nature. And even trying to get Black women historic sites. The first Park Service site to honor an African American woman was the Magdalena Walker home in Richmond, Virginia. Magdalena Walker, she was the first woman president, the first woman to charter a bank in the United States. Her home is in Richmond, Virginia. And Mrs. Bethune and Magdalena Walker were very good friends. So when you actually begin to, read and research a lot of these, people, they knew one another. They're very much connected.
Okay, what happened in Daytona with that school? And then when she obviously left that school in good hands and then made the jump to Washington, is that correct?
Yes. So I guess she never really officially, she didn't resign from the presidency until 1940. So she always, had some type of involvement in her school. So it's, I'm sorry, what was your question? Did I answer it? Oh, so it was while she was raising funds for her school that she became involved in the Black Women's Club movement. And while building her school, while working with these organizations, she caught the attention of President Coolidge and then later President Hoover, because she was doing such great work down there in Daytona. She was one of the few Black female school presidents, principals, as they call them back then. Initially, she started out with 5 girls, ages 8 to 12, plus her son Albert. So he was the only boy for a while there at the school, and it grew very rapidly. By 1923, it had become a junior college, and it merged with the Cookman Institute in Jacksonville, Florida, which was a school for African American boys. So it wasn't until 1923 that it started accepting boys, and that's when it becomes known as Bethune-Cookman College.
So I'm wondering how many schools, or I don't know, because she's so involved in her schools, did she dedicate that school at Bethune Elementary?
So I'm not sure, but I do know that there are many schools throughout the country that are named for her. I do recall reading that shortly before her death, there was a school in the South that did eventually become named for her, and she was able to attend that naming ceremony, but I don't know, any other involvement. Any other questions?
Actually, I have a couple of questions and a comment. Yes, Harriet Tubman was the first African American woman to appear on the stand, and she basically ushered in the Black Harriet series. Then there have been some subsequent ones, of course, Mary McLeod Bethune and a number of others. I just have a couple of quick questions here. Now, she's referred to as Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune. Was that an honorary degree, or did she actually have a doctorate degree? And are there any, her school, for example, Bethune-Cookman down in Florida, are there any historical I should say, initiatives to declare any of those buildings receive some sort of historical designation? Because I know it's one of the oldest black schools in the country. So I'm just curious about whether or not the school itself has achieved any historic designation.
Good questions. Her school, actually, when she retired from the presidency of the National Council of Negro Women in 1949, she left Washington and went back to her real home, which is actually on the campus of Bethune-Cookman. That home, she called it the Retreat. That home is a National Historic Landmark, designated, I believe, in 1976. So there at that home, it's also a museum, and they give tours there as well. When you come to the council house, you'll see her organizational side. But when you go down to Daytona, you'll see her personal side. So a lot of her, jewelry, clothing, personal effects, photographs, things of that nature is down there at her home on the campus of her school. And she's also buried there. I'm not sure about any of the other buildings there on the campus becoming landmarks themselves. I do know that the curator down there, Dr. Ashley Robertson, my colleague, she actually used to work at the council house with me. She's working on trying to get some other types of designation and things down there at Bethune-Cookman, apart from Mrs. Bethune's home. What was your second question? Oh, yes. So Mrs. Bethune, as I said, she went to mission schools, missionary schools. When she went to Scotia, she graduated with the equivalent of a high school diploma. And when she graduated from Moody Bible Institute, she graduated with the equivalent of a college degree. So she never, I guess, officially went to college, but she did receive many honorary degrees throughout her lifetime, starting in the mid-30s, when she begins working with President Roosevelt. That's when she really, I always tell people, from 1935 until 1950, and it's documented, Mary McLeod Bethune was the most powerful African American living in the United States, due to her position in the Roosevelt Administration, her friendship with, not so much a friendship, but her relationship with President Roosevelt, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. She was a sought-after speaker, and the position she had with the National Youth Administration, she was able to bring a lot of attention to the plight of historically black colleges and universities. She spoke on the programs that were offered by the National Youth Administration. So she was, yes, she did receive many honorary degrees during that time period. Any other questions? Well, thank you all for your time. I hope you learned something. Again, the council house, free and open to the public. I'm not sure when we'll be closing to receive the fire suppression system, but again, we're open every day.
All right, so again, I'd like to applaud John for this very informative presentation. I'd also like to encourage everyone to come here next week to hear him discuss Carter G. Woodson House. Again, when you leave, please pick up the brochure because this is the beginning of a series and it ends basically in early October. I believe October the 6th is our last program. So I do encourage you all to come by and to listen to these very informative events, because I think that it captures some of the facilities, some of the locations that we generally are not aware of, or do we believe are part of the National Park Service. So again, thank you for coming out, and I hope to see you in the near future.